Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, folks, we are back to record some more of this book. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the last three videos. As you may have noticed, it's been a very long time since I've gotten back into this. One of the reasons is that our Sabbath services has sort of turned into just reading the Torah portion. And so I figured, well, then, if that's the case, I will begin to put some more of this material out there. I've gotten a lot of positive comments from people. And so here we are. We're on chapter 4, The Two-Nosed Head, Ochino. And for me, reading this book has been very interesting. A lot of historical facts I wasn't completely aware of, but it does add a lot of details into some of the blank spaces that people who study history may have. And so this is a particular subject that is very onerous. It's very, disliked really in the religious community. The idea of is it lawful according to Scripture for a man to have more than one wife or covenant woman? So we're going to continue here. The Two-Nosed Head, Ochino. Bernardino Ochino, the only Italian known to have spread the doctrine of polygamy, must be regarded as something of a freak, for Puritan polygamy never took root in Italy, though Muslim polygamy did. See page 64. Nor indeed in any Catholic country. It is specifically Protestant phenomena. Interesting there. He says it is a specifically Protestant phenomena. It was only when Ochino left his native land and fled to Switzerland, where he became a Calvinist, that the move toward Anabaptism began, and the evolution took almost 20 years to complete. Well, at Anabaptists, if you study them, they were very strong adherents of this concept, sola scriptura, which is scripture alone. And they were harshly treated by the Catholic Church. They were persecuted, many of them were martyred. However, it is doubtful whether he would have steered such a course but for his Franciscan background. The followers of St. Francis had always preached the love of God, spontaneous and inner fervor, austerity, piety, and humility. And although all these tendencies were kept firmly under control by a hierarchical church, they formed a leaven which, as the Curia of Rome was well aware, could easily give rise to undesirable ferments. If Ochino was able to develop his unorthodox views so fully and over so long a period, this was because until such before his flight to Switzerland in 1562, liberal trends within Catholicism were strong. Some 10 years later, the Counter-Reformation had taken such a hold in Italy that any scope for dissent was eliminated. So what this is talking about is the backlash against Martin Luther, who led the Protestant Reformation, and there were many other ministers that came up, John Calvin, Zwingli, and so on, during that time. And the Catholic Church began to lose its iron grip in Europe. And so, as a result of that, there was a backlash. The Catholics realized they were losing their grip, and they wanted to clamp down even tighter, and they used violence. Absolute horrific violence to do so. Born in Siena in 1487, Ochino took his vows as a Franciscan, but subsequently joined the Capuchins, a radical offshoot of the followers of St. Francis, famous for its inflexible devotion to Lady Poverty. Such, says Professor Bainton, were Ochino's zeal and ability that, at the age of 51, he became general of the order in 1538. So this was a high-ranking Catholic. He was perfect exemplification of the medieval saint, austere, emaciated, frail, and vulnerable, and venerable rather, which means he had respect. with the rapt and ethereal look of a Moses descending from the mount, the glory still haloing his countenance, with a white beard flowing over his coarse brown cowl, and his feet bare, he trampled the thoroughfares of Italy. His sermons were marked by chaste diction and vibrant emotion. So great was his popularity that the Pope had to regulate his engagements. Pope got a little bit of jealousy going there, didn't he? Huge throngs assembled hours in advance of his coming. The Emperor Charles particularly delighted to hear him. At Venice, Cardinal Bembo declared that such a saintly man had never seen. He had never seen. So saintly a man he had never seen. In Rome at 2 o'clock in the morning, an assembly gathered, including 12 purpled cardinals. When the service ended at 6 o'clock, the preacher was scarcely able to finish his sermon because of the tears of the audience. But gradually, because of the emphasis of inward piety, Ochino slid down the slope that led to Protestant heresy. Notice how this book, it's in the mindset of the Catholics. It's trying to get into the mindset of both the Catholics and the Protestants. The final break came in 1542, just before the Roman Inquisition was established and all the liberal trends in the church defeated. The choice for reformers like Ochino was, he later alleged, between death and exile, and he chose the latter. He fled to Switzerland. At Zurich, he met the Swiss reformer Bullinger, who describes him in 1542 as a man distinguished by the sanctity of his life, of a vast culture, venerable, white-haired, and tall, of a majestic bearing. The admiration of the Italian exiles for him, noted Bullinger, verged on idolatry. He finally settled in Geneva, who gave him a warm welcome. For his part, he was enchanted with the city of the saints. Converts from Catholicism were expected to renounce celibacy as proof of their sincerity, and Ochino accordingly married a girl from Lucca, who had listened to his sermons. He was nearly 60. Interesting. Later, he moved to Augsburg, the better to support his family. There he preached to a cultured colony of 200 Germans of the great banking houses of Wessler and Fugger, who had served their apprenticeship in Venice, the fountainhead of their craft. When Augsburg made its peace with the Catholic emperor, Ochino was forced in 1547 to seek refuge in England. He at once found a host of distinguished patrons. He was given a pension from the privy purse by King Edward VI. One of his works was translated into English by Anne Cook, the mother of Francis Bacon. The future Queen Elizabeth translated into Latin another of his writings and had frequent discussions with him on such recondite subjects as predestination. Ochino later published a record of these talks in a book. Looks like it's in Latin, Labyrinthi, which he dedicated to her after her ascent to the throne. He also composed a play against papal power called a tragedy, which has served only in the English and Polish versions, and which appears to have inspired Milton with certain passages in Paradise Lost. With the ascension of Queen Mary to the throne and the reintroduction of Catholicism, Ochino returned to Switzerland and after some time settled in Zurich. In 1563, evading the local censorship, he had the dialogues, translated into Latin by a friend, published at Basel. The appearance of the book caused an uproar. There is lively contemporary account of a discussion on the subject in the Ox Inn at Basel. The argument started off quietly enough with the unexceptional view that toleration in religious matters was the work of the devil. On this point, all the merchants, Swiss or German, who had come to the fair were agreed, but harmony ceased abruptly when they came down to particular cases. The Swiss pointed an accusing finger at Nuremberg, a chaotic city where everyone was allowed to hold whatever opinions he wanted. But what about Zurich? Countered a German nobleman from Baden. A nest of brigands and heretics, if ever there was one. The Zurichers, tempers rising, demanded proof. It was readily forthcoming. A repulsive tract, said one of the Germans, is going the rounds. It is printed here in Basel, but it is the work of a certain Bernardino Ochino, who preaches in Zurich. It is so full of horrible blasphemies that a decent Christian shudders to read it. And sort of a reader's note here, I think most of us would probably identify with that kind of response. I mean, when you teach people the law of Elohim, and in particular the laws inherent in the regulation of marriage, you get quite a different picture than what the general churches are teaching, in particular the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, the majority of them. And then when you look at the freedoms that are inherent in the law of Elohim, when you talk about a man is not restricted in having one wife, this really is quite an upsetting thing, and you have this knee-jerk reaction. Same thing happened back then. And the merchants gave chapter and verse for their charges. The book even justified polygamy by citing the examples of the Old Testament patriarchs. The Swiss listened incredulously. In a well-ordered country like theirs, such outrageous writings were impossible. If you don't believe me, said their informant, I'll take you to the printing press where this filth was published. 600 copies sold already, and many of them to the Lutheran stronghold of Wittenberg. But of course, the city fathers of Basely, as soon as they got wind of the affair, banned the book at once. Thus alarmed, Zurich followed suit. The incriminating work, which is looks like 10 dialogues, was examined by the guardians of the doctrine. They were horrified by what they found, the more so because it came from the pen of the highly respected and celebrated Ochino, for he might be the only pastor of a small congregation of Italian-speaking Swiss from Locarno, but he was a figure of European eminence. The book contains such abhorrent considerations as the implicit condemnation of the burning of Servetus at the stake in Calvinist Geneva, and which was even nearer to the bone of the execution by drowning of the Zurich Anabaptist. Okay, so essentially Ochino was sticking up for these martyrs, that he was saying they never should have been killed, that this was tantamount to murder. And there were many, many. I don't think the modern mind can really comprehend the barbarous nature of the Catholic Church at that time, and the fact that the most devilish devices of torture were used on people simply because they had a different opinion. They read the scriptures and they came up with a different opinion than the established church. But what gave rise to the greatest scandal was probably the dialogue on polygamy. This is number looks like 10, so it's 21, looks like. And no wonder, this is the Roman numerals here. And no wonder it was not only the subject and approach, but also the style which causes offense. I think it might be 21. I think you take the 10. I'm a little rusty on my Roman numeral system, but I think it might be 21. This work is neither an impassioned defense of a creed like the Restitution, nor a stodgy, verbose, and basically unreadable treatise such as Lenin's Neobolus. It is effervescent, witty, and convincing. So, this guy knew how to write, and he knew how to engage attention. And so that's part of the reason why he aroused the ire of the more traditional Catholics, of course, and of course, maybe even some Protestants. And though there is no satirical intent, Ochino looks forward to Pascal's brilliantly malicious skit on the Jesuits, the provincial letters. Ostensibly, the dialogue is an unbiased discussion of the question between Ochino, who defends monogamy, and Polygamous, who has a barren and unhealthful wife, but who cannot do without the company of women. Besides, he desires to have children. In fact, Ochino is beaten all along the line and merely puts up the standard objections to polygamy to have them refuted by his much more able and convincing opponent. So this is it's quite a ingenious way to approach this. He positions himself as the opponent to polygamy, but he writes it in such a way that it sounds like he's doing a very bad job defending monogamy. And this counter individual who supports polygamy is beating him at every point. That was the tenor. That was the way it was presented at that time. And so on the surface, it would be hard to argue, well, wait a minute, Ochino, what's he really arguing for here? Is he arguing for, monogamy and he's just doing a really bad job of it? Or is this a very sly way of getting the discussion into the public domain and basically making the monogamy position, which Orthodox Churchianity at the time holds too fastly, look really stupid, essentially. Ochino fires the opening shot against polygamy. Marriage should only be one woman, since God made only Adam for Eve for Adam. Had he wished, God could have created several. To which Polygamous replied that mankind is under no obligation to copy Adam in all respects. We do not, for example, go about in sheepskins like our first ancestors. I think we've heard some of these before. Or even originally, it says they were naked, essentially naked, right, in the garden. Then the father gave them skins. But goes on, Ochino, God commands the man shall cleave to his wife, certainly says his opponent, but God also orders us to cleave to our neighbor. There is nothing to prevent us from cleaving to more than one. The same proposition applies to wives, nor does God say of the first couple that the twain shall be one flesh. He says that they shall be one flesh. He does not specify that there shall be only two. A man could be equally one flesh with 100 wives. If matrimony is not in itself evil, it cannot be evil with two wives. But if more than two can cleave together, why cannot several men cleave to one woman, as Ochino says? You see, he's taking the counter position. One woman can, after all, have to do with several men, and are sick men as well as sick women. Polygamous gives the traditional reply that man is the head of the woman. It would be monstrous for the body to have two heads. In any case, polyandry does not further procreation, which is the main objective of marriage. When it came to stopping polyandry, there was always complete agreement among men of all beliefs. So Ochino's arguments are put up and knocked down, one after the other, like ninepins. What about Abraham and David? Asked the polygamist. These ancients were holy men, yet did they sometimes sin, reports Ochino. Yes, replied Polygamous, but they continued in their sins till their day of their death. Yet, on Ochino's reasonings, they would have been damned. Besides, David was reproached by the Lord for his adultery, but never for his polygamy. Indeed, God says clearly to David that he had given him many wives. Though you read the whole Bible over, you will never find that God has forbade the having of diverse wives. In short, God blessed the plural marriages of these holy men, the first father of the world. Moses, far from mentioning such a man, sets forth provisions for the treatment of children in case where a husband has two wives, one beloved and the other not. And from these passages it follows by the word of God that all the children are legitimate from diverse wives by the same husband. Nor does the New Testament in any way contradict the Old. If Paul tells the bishops to have only one wife, this means that others are implicitly allowed to have more than one. Interesting state there. And that it was the custom of those times for them to have more. In line with this tolerance, polygamists among the early Christians were baptized unconditionally. That's an interesting admission there, isn't it? In this discourse that Ochino writes, that in the early church, polygamy was practiced, and perhaps more commonly than churchdom likes to admit. And what if women object? First replies the indefatigable polygamist, many will not. They may even give their consent, as did Sarah when she allowed Hagar to go in unto Abram, and by permission of the first and second wives, a man may marry a third. All this will be much easier if the wives are instructed that it is no sin with their consent to marry other wives. If a wife is barren, it is indeed her duty to give such consent, and even to exhort the husband to take another companion, as Sarah did of old. If the wife is unwell, in childbed, or no longer fertile, her husband may take another wife. Even if she is sound and fit for generations, she ought to take it in good part. If, enjoying the company of her husband at some certain times, she leave it free for him to enjoy the carnal acquaintance of his other wives. And if love is wanting on the part of the additional wives, this is the fault of the wives and not of the polygamy. In other words, he's putting the burden of fault on the fact that women in general, especially due to cultural reasons, are given to jealousy, but such only as are moderated with reason. Population is the main justification of polygamy, and the souls of men are of so great price that we should in no way hinder existence. The ideal breeding formula for mankind is not 300 men to 300 women, but 200 to 400. In other words, 200 men, 400 women. In other words, the idea is that if you have a straight ratio, then it would be like each man has two wives, but not necessarily. One man could have three. One could have one, another could have 40. See, it will still work out to 200 men, 400 women. The reproductive life of one man is flatly asserted equals that of two women. Look at the animal world. One cock has many hens, one bull, many cows. Our resistance to polygamy is due solely to upbringing and custom. Polygamy is widely practiced by many nations as a good thing and very profitable to mankind. Only in Europe do people abhor it, and there vice has abounded, not a whit less than in all the parts of the world. Even in Europe, it has been practiced in early Christian times. Christian emperors such as Valentinian not only had several wives, but explicitly allowed polygamy. Lothair of France, Pepin, Charlemagne, and Emperor Barbarossa all had several wives. The insistence on monogamy was arbitrarily introduced by the Church as late as AD 600, just as the celibacy of the clergy is a novelty for which there is no biblical warrant. And if the Church has erred for so long, this is man's error, not God's. This is man's error, not God's. That's not a question. Let me read that again. And if the church has erred for so long, this is man's error, not God's. Having a second marriage is only permissible provided the man have a call from God and be moved not by the impulse of the flesh, but by the Spirit, that he may have children and bring them up in the fear of the Almighty. And in the end, when polygamous comes back to his personal case and asks what he should do, Ochino, in the same spirit, first tells him to pray God for the spirit of continence, and if that fails, to do what God shall incline him to, and he will not sin. So ends this remarkable document. It is the most complete exposition of the arguments in favor of Old Testament polygamy ever written, and the most persuasive, except for a latter apology directly inspired by it. The city fathers of Zurich then had ample reason for reacting violently to the book. Summoned before them, Ochino tried to justify himself by condemning, we do not know how sincerely, the Anabaptists, and by appealing to Luther's early writings in favor of polygamy. And the case of Philip of Hesse, the council was in no mood to listen to such arguments. The Calvinists had never regarded Old Testament polygamy as other than a deplorable lapse. Calvin himself felt that for the practice of polygamy, Abraham had a special reason which is not valid today, in that it was useful for him to raise up seed for the fulfillment of the promise. Similarly, Jacob was justified in using the handmaidens at the assistance of his wives, but the taking of Rachel was inexcusable, for this was an indulgence of the flesh. Imagine that argument. Here is Jacob hoodwinked by Laban and given the less comely wife, Leah, and in Calvin's view, to take what he rightfully paid for was wrong, was an act of the flesh. In short, polygamy was and continued to be a crime. Although Ochino's own congregation stood by him, the town council decided to banish him for having, among other things, defended polygamy to the detriment of the purity of Christian doctrine. It was in the depth of winter. He begged to be allowed to delay his departure, but he had accused the council so violently of having refused him a fair hearing that he was ordered to leave within 3 weeks. On the 2nd of December, he set out for exile with his 4 children and without his wife, who had just died as a result of a fall. This sentence disposed of the man, but the book itself and its ideas continued to circulate. Now, listen to that. What it's saying is that this town literally isolated this man and kicked him out, and he died as a result of exposure. And who knows what happened to his children? Maybe his children died too. They called for an authoritative refutation, and this was forthcoming on Polygamy and Divorce, published in Geneva in 1569 by the leading Calvinist theologian de Beze. It is a scholastic, logic-chopping document, each heresy being followed by counter-arguments. I reply first, second, third, etc. De Bez does not deviate from orthodox line by an inch. Polygamy may have been tolerated by God in the Old Testament, but sin it was then, and sin it remains. He makes effective play with the incest, which is inevitable in any system which traces back mankind's origin to a single couple. Incest was practiced then, he observes, but could not possibly be tolerated now. The same is true of polygamy. If ever, he said, there was an age when the propagation of the race was important, it was this. Then it was necessary for a brother to marry his sister, which is even more repugnant to the moral sense than polygamy. As it was, this institution crept in gradually like other vices. There is no reason, says de Bez briskly, to be surprised at God's failure to reprove the patriarchs for their polygamous aberrations. God says not a word against Jacob's incense, since he married two sisters, nor of Lot's amours with his daughters, or of David's outrageous judgment for Sheba against Mephibosheth. And with a shrewd hit at Ochino's mark about polyandry, he notes that it is no more abnormal for a body to have many heads than for a head to have two noses. Nature is as it is. Interesting, these arguments, aren't they? But he obviously, there are some misconceptions here, because it actually says that in the Torah, it actually says that if a man take a sister, in other words, a woman and then her sister, he cannot do so if the goal is jealousy and rivalry. Well, he obviously takes the very conservative view that that's a strict prohibition. So you see that in his argumentation. And now this outrageous judgment for Sheba against Mephibosheth, that's an interesting one. Nor of Lot's. Now, obviously, the Bible does not directly, it simply relates regarding Lot, but it also notes that Lot was perhaps a bit foolish. But it also notes very clearly that it was without Lot's knowledge or will, that this was the actions of his daughters alone. And so he's using this as a platform to propose and propagate the notion that so he's connecting these things in such a way that makes polygamy look bad. And this is what this guy, is doing here. And this is well after Ochino's death. Why does Ochino suddenly launch out into a defense of polygamy? One explanation is that he had in mind the case of King Sigismund, Augustus of Poland, to whom one of the dialogues is dedicated. The circumstances were very similar to those of Henry VIII. Sigismund had married Katerina, the sister of his first wife, Barbara Radziwill, but Katerina was unable to give him an heir. Like Henry, Sigismund believed that God was punishing him for having offended against the Levitical precept by marrying his wife's sister. He tried to secure an annulment, but the House of Habsburg would have none of it. And Bishop Uchansky, again, the parallel with the English case is close, suggested a bigamous marriage as a way out. It has been argued that Ochino had Sigismund in mind in writing his dialogue, but men of his stamp do not write pamphlets on basic moral values simply to please a patron. The real reason must be sought in the man's essential attitudes. We may dismiss as absurd the suggestion of Moreri, the 17th century Catholic encyclopedist, that Ochino wrote the work to justify his libertinism. A man of 76 does not have the recourse to radical theories to satisfy his sexual desires, if any. The real answer is probably to be sought in the gradual evolution of the Italian preacher toward Anabaptist doctrines. His Franciscan background, with its emphasis on inner fervor and piety, predisposed him in this direction, as already noted. Calvin, after initially welcoming him, had grave suspicions of his tendency to put the Spirit before the gospel, and his constant appeal to the need for a call from God, if polygamy is to be justified, and is completely in line with the Anabaptist creed. For that matter, his views on other cardinal dogmas, such as the Trinity, clearly suggest the same conclusion. As it was, his ways were to bring him in the end to the Anabaptist fold. From Zurich, he made his way to Poland, but was banished again as a result of direct intervention from the church. 3 of the 4 children accompanied him, died of the plague. So this gives an idea of what happened after he was banished, probably due to the exposure of elements. This was in the winter, and 3 of his 4 children died. So then he has just 1 child. He set out for Moravia. He sought refuge with an Anabaptist emigre and ended his life in open sympathy with that sect. In the heterodox polygamous tradition, he forms the main link between the Anabaptists and their 17th century descendants. So when it says ended his life in open sympathy with the sect, I'm not sure it's talking about he committed suicide. I think probably what it means is toward the end of his life, that's where he ended up. So that is basically the completion of this chapter. And there's a lot of interesting details there, isn't there? All right. So I think probably what we're going to do here is 48 minutes. That's pretty good. I think we'll leave there, and we'll pick up, hopefully, Almighty willing, chapter 5, A Life for Polygamy later. Okay? And hopefully we can get more of this material out for you. I'm glad I'm picking this back up. We're about 28% through the book. And so there's a lot of material here to consider. And hey, if you got some comments, put them down there for me. And hopefully, we can talk about them together.